The dress had taken her 3 weeks to finish. Lottie had sewn it by candlelight, pulling thread through ivory fabric long after the rest of the Ashvale pack had gone to sleep. Her fingers still carried the small scars from the needle, a dozen tiny punctures along her left index finger that she'd stopped noticing by the second week. The gown wasn't extravagant. She had no silk, no embroidered panels, no pearls to stitch along the neckline the way the noble daughters of the greater packs would wear, but the cut was clean, the waist fitted, and when she'd held it up against the weak morning light, it had looked like something that belonged in the grand hall of Erinmore, rather than in the back room of a tanner's cottage. She had made it for tonight, for him. For the moment, Aldrich Voss would stand before the assembled packs of the Northern Covenant, and finally, say her name. They had been promised to each other since she was 19, not formally, not with a bonding ceremony or the exchange of scent marks, nothing so official as that, but Aldrich had told her, in the dark of the mill house with his hands cupping her face and pine resin burning in the brazier between them, that he would choose her at the Covenant gathering. That when the alpha heir of Voss presented himself to the assembled lords and named his intended before the Alcatia elders, he would speak her name, Lottie Ashvale. He had said it like it meant something. She had believed him for 2 years. The grand hall of Erinmore was older than anyone's memory of it. The stone walls had been built before her pack, before the Voss line, before the Covenant itself. Dark granite quarried from the Thornback Mountains and fitted without mortar by hands that, according to the elders, had not been entirely human. Torches burned in iron brackets every 4 feet along the walls, and the smoke curled upward into the vaulted ceiling, where old pack banners hung in permanent shadow. The banners hadn't been touched in generations. Some had faded to colorless rags. Others still held their sigils in deep crimson and forest green, wolves rampant on fields of black. Lottie stood near the edge of the main floor and let herself feel it. The weight of the hall, the noise of 200 wolves gathered in formal assembly, the smell of candle wax and roasted meat, and the sharp layered scent of pack affiliations that turned the air into something almost visible. Every pack had its own signature. The Voss line smelled of iron and cold water. Ashvale smelled of smoke and pine. The packs from the eastern reaches carried something darker, like soil after rain. She touched the seam at her waist where the thread had pulled slightly on the left side. She'd noticed it an hour ago and had no way to fix it now. "You look beautiful," said a voice at her shoulder. Riva, her oldest friend, Ashvale-born, and sharp-tongued in the way of people who had grown up with nothing to protect them, except their own words. She was shorter than Lottie, dark-haired, wearing a dress borrowed from her older sister that didn't quite fit across the shoulders. She had spent 20 minutes attempting to hide this with a wool shawl and had largely succeeded. "I look nervous," Lottie said. "You look beautiful and nervous, both things." Riva pressed a cup of warmed wine into her hands. "Drink this. It won't help, but it'll give you something to do with your hands." Lottie drank. The wine was spiced with clove and something sharper beneath it, the Erinmore house blend. Sweetened enough to be pleasant, strong enough to matter. She let it sit warm in her chest for a moment and watched the room. The presentation would happen at the 3rd bell. The alpha heir of each attending pack would stand before the Covenant lords, speak his lineage, and name his intended if he had one. It was a tradition older than most of the families in this room, a public declaration that served as both a social contract and a territorial statement. Choosing a mate publicly meant the choice was witnessed, recorded, and binding in the eyes of the Alcatia. No elder could contest it afterward. No family could intercede. It was the one moment when even a girl from Ashvale, with no title and no dowry, and a father who had died owing debts to 3 separate packs, could become something else entirely. The 3rd bell rang. The presentations began at the far end of the hall. The lesser heirs first, youngest sons of minor packs, who named women from families of similar standing. The room watched with polite attention. Names were spoken. The Covenant scribes recorded them in the bound ledger kept on the elders' table. Everything proceeded as it always had. Then Aldrich Voss walked to the center of the floor. He was handsome in the way of men who had always known they were handsome, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, carrying the Voss iron-cold scent in a formal coat of deep charcoal wool. He walked like he owned the stones beneath his feet, and in some sense, he did. The Voss pack controlled half the northern trade routes, and 3 of the 7 passes through the Thornback Range. His father stood at the elders' table with his arms folded, watching. Lottie set down the cup. Aldrich spoke his lineage clearly, his voice carrying through the hall without effort. Second son of Garrett Voss, heir to the Iron Gate seat, blood of the Northern Covenant since the founding generation. The Covenant scribe nodded and prepared to write. Then Aldrich paused. It was a small pause, barely a breath. But Lottie had spent 2 years learning the specific rhythm of this man, and she felt it like a stone dropping through still water. He turned his head slightly, not toward her. Toward the right side of the hall, where the daughters of the greater noble pack stood in a group near the carved archway. Toward a woman in deep blue silk with pale hair, and the particular kind of stillness that came from being coached since birth in how to be looked at. Maren Caldwell. Eldest daughter of the Caldwell pack, which controlled the southern passes, and had recently lost 2 of them to a territorial dispute. A pack that needed alliance badly, and would offer significant concessions to get it. "I name," Aldrich said. "Maren Caldwell of the Southern Reach." The scribe wrote it down. The hall did not react dramatically. It was too composed a room for that. But sound shifted, attention moved. And in the specific corner of the room where Ashvale stood, where 2 or 3 people knew exactly what this moment should have been, there was a silence so complete it had weight. Lottie did not move. She understood what had happened with a clarity that was almost physical. It arrived not as surprise, but as the confirmation of something she had refused to let herself suspect. The political logic was clean and obvious now that she could see it. Voss needed the southern passes. Caldwell needed the Voss name. She had been a placeholder, a private comfort during the years when the alliance hadn't yet been necessary. And now it was necessary, and she was not. She did not cry. She would not do that here. She set the empty cup on the nearest table with a care that surprised even her, setting it down gently, precisely, as if the cup mattered. Then she picked up the hem of her dress and turned toward the side corridor that led to the smaller entrance, the one used by servants and tradespeople, the one that would take her out of this hall without requiring her to walk the full length of the main floor under 200 pairs of eyes. She made it 12 steps. She became aware of the shift in the room not through sound, but through scent. Something changed in the air, not the familiar layered mix of pack affiliations and candle smoke and wine, but something new entering from the main doors at the far end of the hall. Something that cut through all of it like a blade through cloth, power. The specific, unmistakable scent of it. Dark cedar and stone and something electric beneath, like the air before lightning. She didn't turn around immediately. She kept walking. Then she heard the hall go quiet, not the polite quiet of social attention. The instinctive quiet of an entire room of wolves recognizing something above them in the hierarchy and going still in response. The silence of prey recognizing a predator. Except these were not prey. These were lords and heirs and pack leaders, and they had gone silent anyway. Lottie stopped. She turned. At the main entrance to the Grand Hall of Erinmore, flanked by 2 men who themselves radiated enough authority to silence a room, stood a figure she had never seen in person but recognized immediately, the way every wolf in the Northern Territories would recognize him, the way his reputation preceded him like a weather front. Theron, the Alpha King. He was not wearing the crown. He rarely did, according to every account she had ever heard. He didn't need to. He was taller than the men beside him, broader, and he moved through the doorway with the particular stillness of something that had never needed to announce itself. His coat was dark, his jaw sharp, his eyes the color of deep amber in torchlight. He was scanning the room with a calm, unhurried attention, not the look of someone searching for a specific target, but the look of someone absorbing everything at once, cataloging, weighing. Those eyes moved across the hall and stopped. On her. Lottie stood at the edge of the side corridor in her handmade ivory dress, with the slightly pulled seam at the waist, 12 steps from the exit, and the Alpha King of all the Northern packs looked directly at her, and did not look away. She felt it in her spine first, then in her chest. Then, with a horror that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with timing, she thought, not now. Of all the nights in 7 years, not this one. Because she knew something about Theron that he did not yet know about her, and somewhere in the eastern wing of Erinmore's guest quarters, asleep under borrowed blankets in a room she had arranged through Riva's cousin, was a 7-year-old boy with amber eyes and dark hair who had asked her 3 days ago why kings didn't have to share their food at banquets. Her son. Theron's son. The hall breathed around her. The Alpha King had not moved. He was still watching her with that unreadable, absolute attention, and beside her, very quietly, Riva made a sound that was not quite a word. "Lottie," she whispered. "Why is the Alpha King staring at you?" Lottie had no answer that she could give in this room. She had no answer she could give anywhere. Not tonight. Not with the scent of him filling the hall and her dress still carrying the needle scars of 3 weeks of hope she had spent on the wrong man. She stood very still, and she breathed. And she did not run. She counted her breaths the way her mother had taught her. 3 counts in, 4 counts out. The old Asheville rhythm used before hunts, before fights. Before anything that required the body to stay calm while the mind worked through fear. It was not working particularly well. Theron had moved into the hall. He moved the way large predators moved in open terrain, without hurry, without the performance of authority, simply occupying space as if the space had always been meant for him. The 2 men who flanked him were no less impressive on closer examination. One was lean and dark, with the kind of sharp-edged handsomeness that came packaged with obvious awareness of itself. He was already scanning the room with a slight smile, the expression of someone who found most situations mildly entertaining. The other was broader, quieter, with close-cropped hair, and the flat, assessing gaze of a man who counted exits before he counted faces. The Covenant Lords had recovered enough to begin the formal greeting. Elder Harwick, the oldest member of the assembled council, and the man responsible for Erinmore's hospitality, was already crossing the floor with his hands extended and his expression performing the precise mixture of honor and composed surprise, appropriate for an unannounced royal arrival. Lottie used the distraction. She did not run. Running would draw attention, and her wolf knew better than to bolt from something that apex. It would trigger every instinct in the room, and the last thing she needed was 200 wolves watching her flee from the Alpha King, like she had something to hide. She turned smoothly, the way a woman might turn after realizing she'd forgotten something, and walked the remaining 12 steps to the side corridor with her shoulders straight and the seam at her waist pressed flat beneath her palm. Riva caught up with her before she reached the first turn. "Explain," Riva said, matching her stride. Her shawl had come partially loose, and she was holding it with one hand without looking at it. "Not here. You just made eye contact with the Alpha King for approximately 10 seconds while every person in that hall watched, and now you're power walking through a servant's corridor in the only nice dress you own, so I think here is exactly where you explain." Riva. Lottie. She stopped walking. The corridor was narrow and smelled of old stone and the tallow from the wall sconces, and the noise of the hall was muffled now to something distant and manageable. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed. "I met him," she said. 8 years ago, before he was crowned. He was still just the heir, traveling the northern packs before his ascension. He came through Asheville during the winter assembly. Riva stared at her. "You met the..." "Lottie, I was at that assembly. You left early. Your mother was ill. I remember." A pause. The pieces assembling themselves behind Riva's eyes in a way that was almost visible. The heir who came through stayed 3 days. There was a storm that sealed the pass and he couldn't leave. Another pause. Longer. "You were 22. "Yes. And you spent the second and third nights." Riva stopped. Her voice had gone very careful. "You told me it was nothing. When I came back and asked, you said it was nothing. I know what I told you, Lottie." Riva stepped closer, her voice dropping below a whisper now. "Cale is 7. The name landed in the corridor like a stone dropped into deep water. Cale. Her son, 7 years old, dark-haired and amber-eyed and relentlessly curious about the mechanics of everything, how locks worked, why snow melted faster in the sun than in the shade, whether wolves in their animal form could understand books if someone read aloud to them. He had her mouth and her stubbornness, and his father's eyes so precisely that sometimes she could not look at him in certain lights without her chest doing something painful and complicated. "He doesn't know," Lottie said. "I understand he doesn't know. Does Cale know?" "Cale knows his father isn't present. He's never asked for more than that." She exhaled. "He's 7, Riva. He thinks kings are interesting primarily because they don't have to share food. Despite everything, Riva's mouth twitched. Then her expression reset into something serious and a little frightened. Lottie, he's here. Theron is here, in this hall, and he looked at you the way. He looked at you like he knew something. He looked at me because I was the only person in a room full of wolves who didn't immediately bow or go still when he walked in. That's all. Is it? She didn't answer that, because she didn't fully believe it herself. And Riva knew her well enough to read the silence. The scent had reached her across the hall before she'd turned to look. That was the part she hadn't said aloud. She'd felt him. Not just recognized the room's reaction, but felt the specific pull of a scent she had spent 7 years trying to forget, layered into her memory so deeply that her wolf had recognized it before her mind had caught up. Dark cedar and stone and that electric undercurrent that she had once described to herself in the weakness of a winter night 8 years ago, as the smell of a decision you couldn't take back. Her wolf remembered him. That was the real problem. I need to check on Kale, she said. I need to make sure he's still in the guest room and that Riva's cousin hasn't let him. My cousin is sensible. Your cousin let him spend an entire afternoon last spring teaching a badger to accept food from his hand. She is not sensible. She is kind, which is different. Riva conceded this with a slight tilt of her head. Go. I'll stay in the hall and watch for movement. If the king's people start asking questions or if anyone seems to be... She stopped. Her eyes went to the corridor entrance behind Lottie. Lottie turned. The lean, dark-haired man from the king's retinue was standing at the entrance to the corridor. He was leaning against the stone archway with his arms folded and his earlier smile present in a form that was somehow simultaneously charming and deeply inconvenient. Up close, he smelled of cedar and iron, the Royal Pack's base scent, with his own particular signature layered over it. He was perhaps 30, with the kind of ease in his own body that came from years of being both dangerous and aware of it. I'm not following you, he said pleasantly. I was looking for the wine storage, which I was told was somewhere in the eastern corridor, and I appear to have taken a wrong turn. The eastern corridor is on the other side of the hall, Lottie said. He didn't move. You left quickly. I had somewhere to be. Most people don't leave quickly when the Alpha King arrives. They tend to stay. They find reasons to be seen. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with open interest. You went the other direction. I'm not most people. No, he agreed. And something in his tone shifted. Not threatening, but more genuine than the surface charm. You're not. I'm Bastion, by the way. If we're going to have a corridor conversation, names seem appropriate. We're not having a corridor conversation. We appear to be having one regardless. He pushed off from the archway and straightened, and she noted that he was taller than he'd seemed at a distance. He's going to want to speak with you. Theron. I've traveled with him for 4 years, and I know what that look means. And tonight, he looked at you the way he looks at things he intends to understand. A pause. I thought it might be useful for you to know that before it happens rather than during. Lottie held his gaze. Why would you tell me that? Bastion smiled. And it was a different smile than the first one. Smaller, more honest. Because that walk you did, leaving with your back straight after what just happened to you in there, was one of the better things I've seen in a hall full of people performing dignity they haven't earned. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that was almost a bow. It seemed like the kind of thing worth acknowledging. He turned and walked back toward the hall. Lottie stood in the corridor with Riva beside her, and the sound of the gathering echoing faintly through the stone, and she pressed her hand flat against the pulled seam at her waist and made herself think clearly. She had approximately 2 hours before the formal dinner ended, and the hall began to empty. Kale was in the eastern guest wing with Riva's cousin. If she moved now, she could reach him, settle him for the night, and arrange to leave Erinmore at first light before the king's retinue began the morning assembly. Ashvale was 2 days' travel. She had a horse. She had enough coin for the road. It was a plan. It was a thin plan, held together with logic and desperation. But it was a plan. Go, Riva said quietly. She went. The eastern guest wing of Erinmore was reached through a covered walkway that connected the main hall complex to the older residential tower. The walkway was open on one side to the courtyard below, and the night air came through sharp and cold and smelling of pine from the forest that pressed against the castle's eastern wall. Lottie walked quickly, Her dress lifted slightly to keep the hem from the damp stones, her mind running through distances and timetables, and the specific logistics of departing a fortified noble house before dawn without drawing attention. She pushed open the door to the small room she'd arranged through Riva's cousin and stopped. Cale was awake. He was sitting cross-legged on the narrow bed with a candle lit on the table beside him, a wool blanket pooled around his waist, and an expression of extreme alertness that meant he had been awake for some time and had been thinking about something with the particular focus he applied to problems he found genuinely interesting. He had her dark hair, slightly disordered, and the amber eyes that she navigated carefully in her heart every day of her life. Riva's cousin, a good-natured young woman named Petra, who was currently asleep in the chair by the door, in a way that confirmed she had tried and failed to keep the boy settled, did not stir. "You came back," Cale said. "I told you I would. You were gone a long time." He watched her cross the room and sit on the edge of the bed. He had his father's quality of observation, the way of looking at something until he understood it. "Something happened. Nothing that concerns you. You have the face you make when something concerns you, but you've decided it doesn't concern me yet." She looked at her 7-year-old son and felt the specific exhaustion of raising a child who was perceptive enough to read her expressions like text. "Go to sleep, Cale. There's a king here," he said. Not a question. Petra told me before she fell asleep. She said the Alpha King arrived tonight without announcement and the whole hall went still. She said it like it was very exciting. He considered. "Is he the kind of king who shares food or the kind who doesn't? I don't know. I'd like to ask him." He said it with complete seriousness. "It seems like important information about what kind of person he is." Lottie reached out and pressed her hand against the side of his head, smoothing his hair back from his forehead, and held the feeling of him. Warm, real, entirely her own, for a moment before answering. "We're leaving in the morning," she said. "Early." Before the hall wakes, Cale looked at her with those amber eyes. "Okay," he said, in the tone of someone who had filed a question away for later. She blew out the candle. She sat beside him in the dark until his breathing slowed, and then she stayed a little longer, listening to the forest against the eastern wall, and the distant sound of the hall, and the wind moving through the covered walkway outside. And she did not sleep. She did not make it to dawn. The knock came at the second hour past midnight. Not the tentative knock of a servant, or the hurried knock of Riva with bad news, but 3 measured strikes against the door that carried in their rhythm the specific quality of someone accustomed to doors opening for them. Lottie was already awake, sitting on the narrow chair that Petra had vacated sometime after the 3rd hour, her cloak folded across her lap and her boots already on. She had been watching the candle she'd relit burn down and thinking about Rhodes. Petra stirred. Cale did not. He slept the way children slept when they were genuinely tired, completely and without reserve, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed. Lottie crossed to the door and opened it, before the second knock could come and wake him. Bastian was not alone. The broader, quieter man from the king's retinue stood slightly behind him, the one with the flat, assessing gaze. And behind them both, filling the corridor with a presence that seemed disproportionate to the physical space available, was Theron. He was not wearing his formal coat anymore. He had exchanged it for something simpler. Dark wool, no insignia. The kind of clothing that would have been unremarkable on anyone else, and was somehow still unmistakably his. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention he'd used across the hall, except that now, there were 6 feet of corridor between them, instead of 60 feet of crowded room, and it was considerably more difficult to manage. "Lottie Ashvale," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not performed, just low even, carrying the particular resonance of someone who had learned that volume was unnecessary. "My Lord King," she said. "Theron." He corrected it without emphasis, as if the title were a formality he tolerated rather than required. His eyes moved briefly to the room behind her, taking in Petra asleep in the reclaimed chair, the narrow bed, the packed travel bag she had not bothered to hide. "You were planning to leave. At first light. We have a long road. We." His attention returned to her face. Not the bag, not the room. Her face. "Your traveling companion, my son." She said it evenly. There was no version of this conversation in which she would apologize for Cale's existence or obscure him. and she would not begin practicing that habit now. He's 7. He sleeps soundly. Something moved through Theron's expression. Not the blank authority she might have expected, but something more specific, more careful. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough for Bastian, to his credit, to develop a sudden interest in the corridor wall to his left. "I would speak with you," Theron said. "Not here. My son is asleep in that room. Petra can sit with him." Bastian offered this without turning from the wall, in the tone of someone contributing practical information while pretending to be elsewhere. "She's reliable. She fell asleep in a chair while watching a 7-year-old. He was very still by that point," Bastian said, mostly. Theron had not looked away from her. "A quarter hour," he said. "There's a receiving room at the end of this corridor. Leave the door open if you prefer." A pause. "I'm not asking as your king." The last sentence landed differently than the rest. She studied him, really looked at him the way she hadn't allowed herself to do across the hall, where looking too long would have been conspicuous. He was 30, perhaps a year or two older. The years since she'd last seen him had settled into his face in a way that made him look less like the air traveling in winter she remembered, and more like whatever he had become in the years between. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before. His jaw was the same. His eyes were exactly the same. Amber. Dark amber in candlelight, like her son's eyes. "A quarter hour," she said. She told Petra, who woke with the guilty alertness of someone aware they had failed at their primary task, to stay until she returned. She looked at Cale once more, deeply asleep, and then she walked down the corridor to the receiving room at the end. It was a small room, clearly used for private conversations rather than formal audiences. 2 chairs, a low table, a fireplace that had been recently lit and was still working its way toward warmth. Theron had preceded her and was standing by the fire with his back partially turned, looking at the flames. The broad, quiet man, she still didn't know his name, had positioned himself outside the door in the corridor. Bastian had apparently decided his presence wasn't needed and had excused himself with a discretion she was beginning to find suspicious in its precision. She sat in one of the chairs. After a moment, Theron sat in the other. The fire was doing useful work now. The room smelled of cedar, from him, and old stone, and the iron of the fireplace, and underneath all of it that electric undercurrent that her wolf had spent 7 years pretending not to remember. "You recognized me," he said. "Across the hall. You're the Alpha King. Every wolf in the Northern Territories would recognize you. You recognized me before the room went still." He said it without accusation, simply as an observation. "Your scent changed when I walked in." "I was near the door. I noticed." A pause. "And you left immediately after." She kept her expression neutral. "I had a prior reason to leave. The Voss heir had just named his intended. I was adjacent to that situation. I know what happened with Voss." His voice didn't change, but something in it did. A flatness that wasn't coldness, but was close to it. "I watched from the entrance." She looked at him directly. "Then you know there's nothing further to discuss about it?" "No." He met her gaze without deflection. "I know there's nothing to discuss about Voss. He made a political choice, and wore it as if it were the only choice available." Something that was not quite a smile crossed his face, brief and without warmth for Aldrich Voss. "He'll find the southern passes more expensive than he anticipated." He let that settle. "That's not why I'm here." The fire crackled. Outside the window, the forest pressed dark against the glass. 8 years ago, he said. The words fell into the room like something inevitable. Lottie held herself very still. "You were passing through Ashvale. There was a storm. 3 days." He was watching her with that unhurried attention. "I remember them clearly. People remember unusual weather." Lottie. Just her name. The way he'd said it 8 years ago in the dark of a different room, in a different kind of storm, without the title that he'd acquired since. She felt it move through her like the cold edge of a blade, not painful, but precise. "You have a son," he said, 7 years old. "Yes." Dark hair. Her hands folded in her lap did not move. "Amber eyes," he said very quietly. The fire, the stone walls, the smell of cedar filling a small room at the 2nd hour past midnight. Lottie looked at the man across from her, the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories, the father of her child. and made a choice about honesty that she had been postponing for 7 years. Yes, she said. The silence that followed was the longest quarter-minute she had lived through. Theron exhaled, not a sharp breath, not a dramatic reaction, but the slow exhale of someone who has been carrying a weight they couldn't name and has just been handed the name for it. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and looked at the fire. "You didn't tell me," he said. "You were the heir. Then you were the king." She kept her voice even. "I was a girl from Ashvale with a dead father and a debt roster and no standing in any pack of consequence. What would I have told you? And to whom? And what would have happened to my son in a royal court that had no space for him? You don't know what I would have. I know what courts do with inconvenient children." She said it without heat, because it wasn't anger. It was a decision she had lived with and examined from every angle for 7 years and still believed was the right one. "I kept him safe. I kept him mine. And I gave him a life that was small but stable, which is more than most." She paused. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything." Theron turned his head from the fire and looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't expected. Not anger, which she had braced for, and not the cold authority of a king managing a problem. Something older than that, something that looked, in the uncertain warmth of the new fire, almost like grief. "What is his name?" he asked. She hesitated for exactly one breath. "Cale," she said. He repeated it quietly, as if testing the weight of it. His expression did not collapse or shift dramatically. He simply sat with the name for a moment, the way a person sat with something they knew they would carry for the rest of their life. "I want to meet him," he said. "He's asleep in the morning." He looked at her steadily. "Before you take him down the road to Ashvale. I want to meet my son." The word "my" was not possessive in the way she'd feared it might be. It was something else. Quieter, more bewildered, more real. She studied his face for the manipulation she'd been trained by 7 years of caution to look for. And she did not find it. And that frightened her almost more than finding it would have. 1 hour, she said carefully. In the courtyard. In daylight, where people can see. "Whatever you need," he said. She stood. He stood. They were closer than they'd been since the corridor, and the cedar scent of him was present and unhelpful, and her wolf was doing nothing useful in response to it. "Lottie," he said her name again, and she stopped with her hand on the doorframe. "I'm not going to take him from you." She didn't turn around. "You'll forgive me if I'd rather see what you do than take your word for what you intend. A beat." "That's fair," he said. She walked back down the corridor to her son. The courtyard at dawn smelled of frost and wet stone, and the pine forest exhaling its night cold into the pale gray light. Lottie had brought Cale down before the castle had properly woken, before the kitchen fires had fully caught, and before the stable hands had begun the morning round. She had told him they were going to meet someone before the road. She had not told him who. Cale had accepted this with the particular patience of a child who understood that adults sometimes needed to arrange things in their own order, and had spent the walk down from the guest wing asking her whether she thought the stones in the courtyard wall were older than the stones in the main hall, and whether the difference in color meant they'd come from different quarries. "Possibly," she had said. "I think yes," he had said, with the confidence of someone who had decided. He was standing now near the center of the courtyard, examining an iron torch bracket that had been mounted low enough for him to reach, turning it in its fitting to test how it moved. His wool coat was slightly too large. It had been made to last 2 winters and was fulfilling that purpose. His dark hair was disordered from sleep, in a way she hadn't fully corrected. He looked exactly like what he was. A small, serious, intensely curious person, encountering the world on its own terms. Theron arrived from the covered walkway at the far end of the courtyard. He had come alone. No bastion, no broad quiet guard, no retinue. He was wearing the same dark wool from last night, and he walked into the courtyard with his hands at his sides and his pace measured in a way that she recognized, after a moment, as deliberate restraint. He was moving carefully, not cautiously in the sense of uncertainty, carefully in the sense of a man managing his own reaction to something that mattered. Cale heard the footsteps and turned. He looked at Theron with the direct, assessing gaze he applied to everything new. No performance of shyness, no retreat, just the clear-eyed measurement of a child who had grown up in a small pack without much social instruction in the art of deference. He looked at this tall man in dark wool standing in the early light of the courtyard and tilted his head slightly. Then he looked at his mother, then back at Theron. The amber eyes, his eyes, Theron's eyes, the same precise shade that she had navigated carefully for 7 years, moved between them with a calculation that was too quiet to be called suspicion and too focused to be called simple curiosity. "You're the king," Cale said. Theron stopped a few feet away. "Yes." Cale considered this. "Petra said the whole hall went still when you came in. That happens sometimes. Does it bother you?" A beat. Something shifted in Theron's expression. Not quite a smile, but in the same direction. "Sometimes," he said. Cale seemed to find this satisfactory. He released the torch bracket and turned fully toward Theron with his hands in his coat pockets. "Do you share food at banquets?" Lottie closed her eyes briefly. "I'm told it's an important question," Theron said. And now there was definitely something in his voice. Controlled, careful, but present. "Where I sit, yes. The portions are larger than necessary. I've been known to share them." Cale nodded, filing this away. "That's good. My mother says you can tell what kind of person someone is by whether they share food or hoard it." He paused. "She also says you can tell by whether they look at the person speaking to them or look past them." She sounds wise. "She's the smartest person I know," Cale said, with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who had not yet encountered a reason to revise this opinion. "She made my coat." Theron looked at the coat. Slightly too large, wool, practical, and then at Lottie, and the look lasted only a moment before he returned his attention to the boy. "Can I ask your name?" Theron said. "Cale." "Cale." He said it the same way he had said it alone in the receiving room last night, with that quality of weighing something. "How old are you?" 7. "I'll be 8 before the first snow." He paused. "How old are you?" "Cale," Lottie said. "It's a fair question," Theron said. "I'm 31. Cale considered the math with visible effort. "That's very old." "It feels that way sometimes." The boy laughed, a short, genuine laugh that he didn't try to suppress. And Lottie watched Theron's face in the moment it happened, and then looked away, because what she saw there was something she didn't have the internal resources to examine yet. They walked the courtyard. She hadn't planned it that way, but Cale had begun moving toward the eastern wall, where the stone variation was most visible. And Theron had fallen into step beside him in the natural way of someone who had decided to follow a child's lead without announcing the decision, and Lottie walked slightly behind them and watched her son explain his quarry theory to the Alpha King of the Northern Territories with complete unself-consciousness. Theron listened. He asked questions, real questions, not the performed interest of an adult managing a child, but the kind of questions that indicated he was actually following the logic and finding it worth engaging with. He crouched at one point to look at a section of wall Cale was pointing to, bringing himself level, and Cale put his hand flat against the darker stone and looked sideways at Theron with the expression he wore when someone had earned the distinction of being genuinely useful. Lottie stood 10 feet away and felt the ground beneath her shifting in a way that had nothing to do with the stone. She had built her precautions on a foundation of reasonable assumptions. That Theron would be what courts produced, that power would express itself as possession, that a king discovering a hidden son would move immediately to claim him as asset or problem. She had been prepared for that. She had 7 years of preparation stored in her chest like armor. She had not prepared for him to crouch beside her son and take the quarry theory seriously. The morning light had strengthened by the time Bastian appeared at the covered walkway. Not intruding, just present, which Lottie was beginning to understand was his specific skill. He caught Theron's glance and held up 2 fingers, which apparently meant something in their private shorthand, and Theron gave a slight nod. He stood and turned to Cale. "I have to attend to something shortly. But I'd like to continue this conversation if you're willing." "About the stones?" Cale asked. "About whatever you find worth explaining." Cale looked at him for a long moment with those amber eyes, and then looked at his mother. And Lottie saw the question in his expression. Not the child's question of "can I," but something older, something that had been living quietly in him for longer than she had realized. A question shaped like a gap in his understanding of his own story. "Mama," he said. "Why does he look like me?" The courtyard was very quiet, the frost on the stones, The pine trees beyond the wall, the pale early sky above Aaronmoor's towers. Lottie looked at her son's face, and then at Theron's face, and then at her son's again, and the answer she had been carrying for 7 years arrived in her throat without ceremony. Because, she said carefully, he is your father. Chaol was still for a moment that seemed longer than a moment. Then he turned and looked at Theron with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the analytical assessment he applied to stones and brackets and questions about kings, but something younger, something that hadn't had the chance to become careful yet. You didn't know, Chaol said. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation, delivered in the quiet voice he used when he was working something out. You just found out, last night, Theron said. Oh. Chaol looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. Are you angry? No. Some people get angry when they find out things they didn't know. I know. Theron's voice was steady and low and entirely honest. I'm not angry. I have a great deal to think about. But I'm not angry at you. And I'm not angry at your mother. Chaol absorbed this. He had his hands back in his coat pockets, and he was standing the way he stood when he was deciding something. Weight slightly forward, jaw set with a determination that was entirely hers by inheritance. She kept me safe, he said. It was not a defense and not an explanation. It was simply a fact he was placing on the table. She always kept me safe. Whatever she decided, she was keeping me safe. Theron looked at her over Chaol's head, and something moved through his expression that she could not name cleanly and did not try to. I know, he said. I believe that. Later, after Bastian had reappeared with the specific timing of a man who had been monitoring the situation from a discreet distance, Theron asked to speak with her alone again, while Bastian walked the eastern wall with Chaol, and answered questions about whether the king's guard horses were faster than regular horses, and whether rank affected feed quality. They stood near the courtyard fountain, which was not running in the cold, its basin filmed with thin ice. I'm not going to ask you to come to court, Theron said. Not like this. Not yet, she waited. But I'm asking you not to disappear back to Ashvale and make this difficult. He chose the word carefully. He deserves to know me, and I... He paused, and for the first time since she had opened the corridor door last night, the careful control in his face showed something underneath. I've missed 7 years. I would rather not miss more. He doesn't know what it means, she said. What you are. What it would mean for his life. I know. He's been happy in Ashvale. Small, but happy. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to hand him to a court. I'm asking you to let me be present, in whatever form you believe is safe. A pause. You get to set the terms, Lottie. You've earned that. She looked at the ice on the fountain basin and thought about roads and safety and the 7-year-old currently interrogating Bastian about horse feed with complete seriousness. We stay through the end of the gathering, she said finally. 3 more days. You spend time with him. In the open, in the courtyard, no court protocol, no announcements. She met his eyes. After that, we talk about what comes next, carefully. Carefully, he agreed. And Theron. She held his gaze. If at any point I believe this is becoming something that puts him at risk, politically, socially, in any way, I will take him and leave, and I will not apologize for it. He nodded once. I wouldn't expect you to. From the eastern wall, clearly audible in the cold morning air, came Chaol's voice explaining that if rank didn't affect feed quality, then it should, because better nutrition would produce faster horses, and faster horses were strategically valuable, and Bastian's response that this was the most sensible military argument he had heard all year. Lottie breathed in the frost and the pine and the cedar that lingered in the cold air beside her, and felt the ground beneath her feet settling into something she didn't have a name for yet. Not safety, not certainty, but something that was pointing, with careful deliberateness, in their direction. The 3 days passed differently than she had expected. She had braced for court mechanics, for the subtle pressures of noble politics inserting themselves into the courtyard mornings, for pack lords finding reasons to observe, for the Alpha King's attention toward a woman of no standing to become a subject of commentary that would require managing. She had prepared herself for the way power moved in noble houses, the sidelong assessments, the careful positioning of bodies in rooms. What happened instead was quieter and considerably more disorienting. Theron came to the courtyard each morning before the formal gathering sessions began. He came without ceremony and without his guard, except for the broad, quiet man, whose name she finally learned was Devon, who stationed himself at the courtyard entrance with the professional invisibility of someone who had perfected the art of being present without participating. Bastian appeared intermittently, drawn by what she suspected was genuine affection for the situation, rather than any official duty. Cale took to it with the same methodical openness he applied to everything new. He did not perform excitement, and he did not perform caution. He simply proceeded with Theron, the way he proceeded with anything he found genuinely interesting, directly, with questions, testing for consistency between words and actions in the quiet way of a child who had learned early that these two things did not always match. On the first morning, he showed Theron the full length of the eastern wall and delivered a complete account of the quarry theory, which Theron followed without visible impatience and contributed to by noting that the darker stone was likely from the Thornback Range based on its color, which Cale received as important new evidence and incorporated immediately. On the second morning, Cale asked with no preamble whether being a king meant you could tell people what to do, or whether it meant you were responsible for them, because he had been thinking about it, and they seemed like different things. Theron had been quiet for a moment. Then he said it was supposed to mean the second thing, and that a great many kings throughout history had confused it with the first thing, and that this confusion had caused most of the worst events in the historical record. Cale had nodded with the gravity of someone confirming a theory. "That's what I thought," he said. "Mama says responsibility is what you owe people who can't protect themselves, not what you do to people who can't stop you." Theron had looked at Lottie over Cale's head, with an expression she was running out of ways to look away from. She watched them. She could not help watching them, not with anxiety, or not only with anxiety, but with the specific attention of someone witnessing something they had not allowed themselves to imagine, and were now having to accommodate in real time, the way Theron listened to him. The way Cale, by the second morning, had begun occasionally standing slightly closer than strictly necessary in the unconscious way of a child testing whether proximity was safe. The way Theron, each time this happened, remained exactly as still as he was, not drawing attention to it, simply allowing it. Riva watched Lottie watching them and said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing Riva had done in their 20 years of friendship. On the second evening, Aldrich Voss found her. She had expected this, or something like it. The gathering was 3 days of confined nobility, in a hall that ran on social currency and observed slights. And Aldrich Voss was not a man comfortable with unresolved narratives. He found her in the covered walkway before the evening meal, alone, which was either coincidence or arrangement, and she suspected the latter. He looked the way men looked when they had made a calculation they believed was correct, and were encountering evidence that the variables had shifted. His iron-cold scent was present and familiar, and entirely without effect on her now, which was information she absorbed with something close to relief. "Lottie," he said, "I wanted to—" "You don't need to," she said. "I made a decision that was politically necessary. I understand." She kept her voice even. "Aldrich, I'm not angry with you. I'm not anything with you. What happened in the hall was what it was. And I wish you and Marin Caldwell a productive alliance." She meant it. Not warmly, but genuinely. The clean absence of attachment was its own kind of freedom, and she had been carrying it since the moment she'd set down the wine cup. "But if you came here to manage how I feel about it, I'd rather you didn't. I have other things to think about." He looked at her with something that was trying to be dignity, and was not quite reaching it. His eyes moved past her to the courtyard visible at the end of the walkway, where Cale was visible in the evening light talking to Bastian, and then, with the particular sharpening of a man who tracked power instinctively, to Theron, who was standing a few feet away, watching Cale with his arms folded and his attention absolute. Aldrich was silent for a moment. "The king," he said carefully, "has been kind enough to spend time with my son during the gathering." She held his gaze. "Good evening, Aldrich." She walked past him and did not look back, and she did not feel the loss of him like a wound, which was how she knew it had already healed over in the way of injuries that were never as deep as they appeared. The third morning came cold and clear, with frost on every surface and the pine forest exhaling clouds of mist against the castle's eastern wall. Lottie came to the courtyard early and found Theron already there, standing by the fountain with a cup of something warm, watching the mist move through the trees. He heard her and turned. He asked me last night, Theron said, whether I would be at the next gathering. She stopped beside him. The fountain basin was frozen solid this morning. What did you tell him? That I would come wherever he was if he wanted me to. He looked at her steadily, and that it would depend on you. He's 7. He's 7, and he understood exactly what that meant. Something in his voice was careful and honest in equal measure. He said, and I'm telling you this precisely, he said that you always do what you say you'll do, and that if you said it was all right, it would be all right. Lottie looked at the frozen fountain. I've been thinking, Theron said, about what you said, about courts and risk, about what it would mean for him. He turned to face her fully. You were right to protect him. Every decision you made, I understand why you made it. I'm not asking you to regret it. A pause. I'm asking you to believe that I can be, that I want to be, something different than what you were protecting him from. That's not a small thing to ask. I know. Trust of that kind isn't, I can't manufacture it, Theron. It has to be built. I know that too. He held her gaze without pressure, without the performance of patience, simply present, simply honest. I have time. I intend to use it. A pause. He's mine, Lottie, and so is whatever it takes to earn your trust. I'm not in a hurry. I'm just present. That's all I'm asking to be allowed to be. She looked at him in the pale morning light, the frost around them, the mist moving through the pines, and let herself see him clearly for the first time without the filter of 7 years of careful distance. The man who had crouched beside her son to look at stones, who had answered a child's questions about responsibility with honesty rather than authority, who had stood in a receiving room at midnight and said, I'm not going to take him from you before she had asked him not to. She had built her life on careful assessment of what people did versus what they said. She had been doing it for 7 years and she was good at it. All right, she said. Theron was quiet for a moment. All right. You'll come to Ashvale, not with the full court, with Bastian if you need someone, and Davon if you need a guard. You'll come as a person, not as a title. She turned to face him. And we'll see. We'll see, he agreed. And the way he said it was not resignation, but something that sounded almost like relief. Cale arrived in the courtyard 20 minutes later, with his coat misbuttoned and a piece of bread in one hand, having apparently negotiated breakfast from the kitchen on his own terms. He looked between them with those amber eyes, and whatever he saw in the space between them seemed to satisfy the quiet question he had been carrying since the first morning. Are we staying longer? He asked his mother. No. We leave today as planned. He processed this, but he's coming to Ashvale. It was not a question. Lottie looked at her son, and then at Theron, and then back at Cale. Yes. Cale nodded and bit into his bread, and turned toward the eastern wall with the air of someone who had allocated that particular matter to the resolved column and was ready to move on to other things. Good. I want to show him the mill stream. The stones there are completely different from these ones. Probably a third quarry source. Bastian, who had materialized at the courtyard entrance with the timing she was no longer surprised by, looked at Theron with an expression of pure satisfaction. Theron looked at his son walking toward the eastern wall with bread in hand, and something passed through his face, complete, unguarded, for just a moment, that she filed away in the part of herself that was slowly learning to trust what she observed over what she feared. They left Erinmore that afternoon, the 3 of them and Riva, on the road south toward Ashvale. The forest pressed close on both sides, and the sky was the particular clear gray of a winter day that hadn't decided yet whether to offer sun. Cale rode in front of Lottie on her horse, and catalogued every rock formation visible from the road, and asked twice whether Theron's horses were genuinely faster, and once whether kings were allowed to be lost in forests, or whether someone always knew where they were. Theron, riding alongside at a distance that was respectful and present in equal measure, answered each question with the same honest attention he had used since the first morning, and Riva rode behind them and said nothing at all, which remained the most eloquent thing she had done in 20 years. 2 months later, Theron came to Ashvale. He came with Bastian and Davon, and no other retinue, on a gray morning in early winter, when the mill stream was running clear and cold over its particular arrangement of stones. Cale was waiting at the edge of the village with his coat properly buttoned, having been informed of the arrival time with a precision that suggested he had been monitoring the road for longer than admitted. He walked Theron to the mill stream, and delivered the third quarry source theory in full. And Theron crouched beside the water, and listened. And Lottie stood on the bank above them, and watched the frost on the reeds, and the clear cold water, and the dark-haired man and the amber-eyed boy side by side, and felt the shape of the life ahead of her settling into something she could hold. It was not the life she had imagined in the hall at Erinmore, in her carefully sewn dress, with her needle-scarred fingers, and her 2 years of hope aimed at the wrong man. It was something she hadn't known to imagine, built from harder materials, assembled with more care, running deeper than anything she had reached for before. It was real. That winter, Theron came to Ashvale 3 more times. By spring, Cale had stopped treating the visits as events, and had begun treating them as the ordinary texture of his life, which was the only measure of trust that Lottie had ever believed in. By summer, Theron had spoken to her, not as a king making an arrangement, not as a man managing a situation, but plainly, in the way of someone who had decided to stop being careful with what he meant. And she had listened, and she had let herself answer in kind. They bonded in the early autumn in Ashvale, before the pack and before Riva, who cried without apology, and before Cale, who stood very straight and serious throughout, and afterward told Bastian that the ceremony was good, but could have included more information about the quarry origins of the ceremonial stones. Aldrich Voss managed the southern passes at considerable expense, and did not attend. The Ashvale pack, small and smoke-scented and older than its standing had ever suggested, was formally recognized that same season as a pack of the Royal Covenant, its debts cleared, its lands secured. The elders who had overlooked Lottie for 23 years attended the recognition ceremony with the expressions of people who had always known she was remarkable. She did not correct them. She had more important things to do. Cale grew up knowing exactly who he was. A boy from Ashvale with a mother who sewed things that lasted, and a father who listened when you explained about stones, and amber eyes that he shared with the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and a life built from nothing by the woman who had loved him long before anyone with power had thought to look her way. He grew up knowing that the right people always found each other eventually. He grew up knowing it was true,